listening to another boring bedtime story by the campfire. Sleep well.
Tsutomu Yamaguchi had always believed that a man's fate was written somewhere beyond his understanding, in a language he would never fully read. He was a quiet man, careful with his words and even more careful with his emotions. He worked as a naval engineer for Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, and he took pride in his precision, in his ability to reduce complex problems to their simplest solutions. He loved his wife, Hisako. He loved his infant son, Katsutoshi. He loved the small routines of his life in Nagasaki, the smell of rice cooking in the morning, the sound of the city waking up around him. In the summer of 1945, Tsutomu was sent on a work assignment to Hiroshima. It was a routine trip, the kind he had made before, and he expected nothing extraordinary from it. He packed his bag with the efficiency of a man who traveled often, kissed Hisako goodbye at the door, and boarded the train without looking back. The city of Hiroshima received him with its usual humid warmth, its streets busy with the sounds of a country still at war, but not yet broken. He had been in Hiroshima for nearly 3 months by the time his assignment neared its end. He had done good work there, careful and thorough as always, and he was ready to go home. He missed Hisako with a quiet ache that he kept tucked inside his chest, and he thought about his son constantly, imagining how much the boy must have grown. The night before he was due to leave, he laid out his clothes, checked his train ticket, and allowed himself a small feeling of relief. The morning of August 6th arrived with a brightness that seemed almost cheerful. Tsutomu woke early, dressed, and gathered his belongings. He was walking toward the tram station, his travel documents in his hand, when he realized he had forgotten something back at the dormitory where he had been staying. He turned around and retraced his steps, cursing himself quietly for the delay. It was a small thing, an ordinary moment of forgetfulness, but that small moment would define the rest of his life. He was about 3 kilometers from the hypocenter when the bomb fell. He did not hear it coming. There was simply the world as it was, and then there was a blinding white light that seemed to erase everything. The sound came after, a pressure wave so enormous that it felt less like noise and more like the end of all noise. Tsutomu was thrown from his feet. He felt the heat on his skin like nothing he had ever felt before, a terrible and total heat that seemed to come from everywhere at once. He lay on the ground for what felt like a very long time. When he finally raised his head, the world around him had become unrecognizable. Buildings that had stood moments before were gone or reduced to skeletal frames. Fires were beginning to rise in every direction. People moved through the smoke and debris in a silence that was more frightening than any scream. Their bodies burned, their expressions empty with shock. Tsutomu's eardrums had ruptured. He could hear almost nothing. He pressed his hands to his face and found that the left side of his body had been burned. He survived the first hours through some combination of instinct and disbelief. He found shelter in an air raid shelter and stayed there through the night, surrounded by the sounds of a city dying. Other survivors moved in and out of the darkness around him, their moans muffled by the ringing in his damaged ears. He did not sleep. He lay still and breathed and tried not to think too deeply about what had happened, because thinking too deeply about it felt like a way of letting it kill him. In the days that followed, Tsutomu made his way through the destroyed city, trying to find a way to get home to Nagasaki. He was bandaged roughly, his burns covered with what little medical supplies remained. Hiroshima's hospitals were overwhelmed, their doctors and nurses working without rest on wounds they had never seen before and had no real way to treat. Tsutomu waited his turn and said nothing about the severity of his pain because every person around him was in worse shape than he could fully comprehend. He thought about Hisako constantly during those days. He imagined her at home, going about her routines, not yet knowing what had happened to Hiroshima, not knowing whether her husband was alive or dead. He wanted desperately to reach her, to tell her that he was all right, that he was coming home. The desire to see her face again became the central engine of his survival, the thing that kept him putting one foot in front of the other through the ruins. He managed to get on a train out of Hiroshima, and the journey home was long and strange. He sat in the crowded car with his burns wrapped and his hearing still largely gone, watching the countryside pass by outside the window. Everything beyond Hiroshima looked so ordinary, so untouched, that it seemed impossible that the world he had just left had existed at all. He felt like a man crossing between two different realities, and he was not sure which one was real. He arrived in Nagasaki and went home to Hisako. She saw him at the door, saw the bandages and the burns and the emptiness in his eyes, and she did not ask him anything right away. She simply took him inside, sat him down, and began to care for him with a gentleness that made him feel, for the first time since the bomb, that he might actually survive. He held her hand that night and could not speak. There were no words adequate to what he had seen. He reported to work at the Mitsubishi offices in Nagasaki on August 9th because that was what a man in his position was expected to do. His burns were still severe, his hearing was still compromised. He moved slowly and with pain, but he came in because staying home felt somehow like giving something up, like admitting a defeat he was not ready to admit. His colleagues looked at him with concern, but said little. People did not speak easily about the things that were happening in those days. He was in the middle of explaining to his supervisor what he had witnessed in Hiroshima when the second bomb fell on Nagasaki. He was describing the white light, the impossible heat, the wave of destruction, and then the world outside the window became that exact description again. The white light returned, the heat returned, the pressure wave hit the building, and everything shook violently, and then, for a moment, there was nothing at all. When Tsutomu came back to consciousness, he was lying on the floor of the office amid broken glass and fallen ceiling material. His already burned skin had been seared again by the new blast's heat. He was disoriented, his mind struggling to process the absurdity of what had just happened. He had survived this before. He had survived this once already, 3 days ago, and now here it was again, the same terrible brightness, the same obliterating force, reaching across the distance from Hiroshima to find him again. He stumbled out of the building into a Nagasaki that was now, like Hiroshima, on fire. The streets were filling with smoke and the sounds of collapse. People were running and falling and calling out names. Tsutomu moved through it all with a strange sense of déjà vu, a nightmarish familiarity, as though he were trapped in a loop that the universe had decided he needed to experience twice. He did not understand why he was still alive. He was not sure in those first moments that he wanted to be. His thoughts went immediately to Hisako and Katsutoshi. He did not know where they were, whether they had been caught in the blast, whether the house was still standing. He began moving in the direction of home, pushing through the debris and the chaos, calling out for his wife. His voice was raw, his body was on fire with pain, but he kept moving because stopping meant not knowing, and not knowing was a thing he could not bear. He found Hisako alive. She had been burned too, caught outdoors when the bomb fell, and their son had been affected by the radiation that was already beginning to poison the city's air and water. But they were alive. They were alive, all 3 of them, in the middle of 2 separate apocalypses, and Tsutomu held his wife against his burned chest and felt something he could not name. It was not quite relief. It was something deeper and more complicated than relief. The days that followed were among the hardest of his life. Nagasaki was devastated in ways that mirrored and somehow intensified what he had seen in Hiroshima. The two cities were turned into the same kind of wasteland, reduced to ash and rubble and silence. Tsutomu moved through the wreckage, helping where he could, carrying water, assisting the injured, doing the small and practical things that humans do in the face of catastrophe, because doing nothing is its own kind of death. He became sick in the weeks that followed, as many survivors. The radiation sickness came with fevers and nausea and a deep fatigue that seemed to reach below the physical into something harder to name. His hair fell out, his appetite disappeared. Hisako cared for him with the same quiet steadiness she had shown when he first returned from Hiroshima, and he held on to her presence as something fundamental, like gravity, something that kept him attached to the earth.
Japan surrendered on August 15th. Tsutomu heard the emperor's announcement over the radio with his still impaired hearing, catching fragments of the broadcast through the static. The war was over. The thing that had sent him to Hiroshima, that had placed him in the path of 2 atomic bombs, was over. He sat very still after the broadcast ended and tried to feel something simple, something clean like relief or joy, but what he felt was far more tangled and hard to hold. He recovered slowly over the following months. His burns healed imperfectly, leaving scars that would mark him for the rest of his life. His hearing gradually returned to a degree, though it was never fully what it had been. He went back to work at Mitsubishi, rebuilt his routines, watched his son grow. Nagasaki was rebuilding itself around him with the same stubborn energy that human beings have always brought to the work of survival. And Tsutomu was part of that rebuilding, whether he had chosen to be or not. For many years he did not speak publicly about what he had experienced. The hibakusha, as atomic bomb survivors were called in Japan, were subject to a complex social stigma. There were fears, often unfounded but powerful, that their radiation exposure made them dangerous, that their children would be born with defects, that associating with them was somehow a risk. Tsutomu and Hisako lived with this quietly, as they lived with most difficult things, by simply continuing to exist and refusing to be diminished. He raised his children with care and love and a particular attentiveness to the fragility of ordinary life. He watched his son grow and eventually watched grandchildren arrive, and each new life in his family felt like an argument against despair, a small piece of evidence that the world was still capable of creating rather than only destroying. He did not speak of the bombs to his children at first, not wanting to fill their childhoods with the weight of what he carried. But the weight was there. It was always there. He had nightmares. He had moments during the day when the brightness of the sun or an unexpected noise would send him back to those 2 mornings, the white light, the heat, the silence that followed the destruction. He learned to manage these moments, to breathe through them, to return himself to the present. But he never fully left those 2 cities, in the way that any survivor of trauma never fully leaves the moment that defined them. Decades passed. Tsutomu grew old in Nagasaki, in the city that had been bombed around him, that had rebuilt itself into something new while he had done the same. He watched the world change in extraordinary ways, watched technology transform daily life, watched wars come and go in other parts of the world, watched the weapons that had twice tried to kill him become the subject of international treaties and political arguments and academic study. He began to speak publicly about his experiences in his later years, after the reluctance of the early decades finally gave way to a sense of obligation. He felt that what he had seen and survived was not simply his own private trauma, but a testimony that belonged in some way to the world.
If he had been given the improbable gift of surviving both bombs, then perhaps the reason was so that he could tell people what they had done to a human body and a human city. He gave interviews, spoke to journalists, met with students and politicians and peace activists. He described the white light with the precision of an engineer, the wave of heat that had no comparison in ordinary experience, the silence that fell over both cities after the initial devastation. He was careful and exact, and people who heard him speak often said that his quietness made the account more devastating than any amount of dramatic description could. He visited schools. He talked to young people about what war looked like when it reached its furthest extreme, when its tools became capable of erasing entire cities in a single moment. He did not do this with anger, though no one would have blamed him for anger. He did it with the measured seriousness of a man who had seen something important and believed that others needed to understand it. He was officially recognized by the Japanese government as a survivor of both bombings, a Niju Hibakusha, a double bomb survivor. The recognition came late in his life, but when it came, he accepted it with his characteristic quietness. He did not seem to need the formal acknowledgement to validate what he had lived through. He had been living through it every day for decades, in the scars on his body and the images in his memory.
His wife, Hisako, developed health problems that her doctors connected to her own radiation exposure, and she died before him. Tsutomu grieved her in the private way that had always characterized his most important emotions, turned inward, contained. But those who knew him said that after Hisako's death, something in him shifted, that he became even more committed to speaking out, as though he were now speaking for her as well as for himself. He wrote about his experiences. He collaborated on books and documentaries. He was the subject of journalistic investigations that tried to piece together the extraordinary coincidence of his survival, the forgotten delivery, the 3-kilometer distance from the first hypocenter, the office building in Nagasaki that shielded him from the second blast's worst effects. But Tsutomu himself seemed uninterested in the mechanics of his survival, in the what and the how. He was more interested in the why, and not in a mystical sense, but in a moral one. Why had these weapons been built, he asked. Why had they been used on cities full of civilians? Why did the world continue to maintain stockpiles of weapons capable of doing what he had seen them do, capable of turning a human body into something unrecognizable in a fraction of a second? These were not rhetorical questions for him. They were genuine inquiries, the questions of a man who had seen the answers lived out in flesh and rubble and ash. He became a figure for the international anti-nuclear movement, not because he sought that role, but because his story made him impossible to ignore. He was living proof of what these weapons did. He had been inside 2 of them and walked away, and the fact that he had walked away did not minimize the horror of what he had witnessed. If anything, it amplified it, because he was able to articulate what so many others who had been closer to the blasts could not. He aged gracefully, in the way that people who have survived catastrophic things sometimes do, as though the worst has already been faced and everything that comes after is somehow lighter by comparison. He still had his scars. He still had his damaged hearing, the legacy of that first blast in Hiroshima on an August morning when he had turned back for a forgotten document. He carried these things not as wounds, but as facts, as part of the material of his life. His children and grandchildren surrounded him in his later years. He was a grandfather who had held 2 atomic bombs at a distance of 3 kilometers and survived. And yet what his family seemed to love most about him was his ordinariness, his quietness, his habit of careful thought before careful speech. He was not a monument to himself. He was simply a man who had seen too much and had chosen to tell the truth about it. He thought often about the other survivors he had known, the ones who had not lived as long as he had. who had died of radiation-related cancers or from the psychological weight of what they had experienced. He thought about the people who had not survived at all, the tens of thousands in each city who had been at the wrong distance or in the wrong building, or who had simply run out of the particular luck that had kept Tsutomu Yamaguchi alive. He carried their absence alongside his own survival. He sometimes wondered what would have happened if he had not forgotten that document. If he had gone straight to the tram that morning and caught the first available train out of Hiroshima, he would have been far from the hypocenter when the bomb fell. He would have gone home to Nagasaki and been there on August 9th, possibly far enough from the second blast to be unaffected. He might have lived his entire life without being touched by either bomb, and nobody would ever have known his name. But that was not what had happened. What had happened was that he had turned back, that the universe had arranged a small piece of forgetfulness at exactly the right moment to place him within range of the first bomb, and then the same universe had arranged for him to be in a building in Nagasaki on the morning of the second bomb, alive enough to be caught in it again. What this meant was a question he could not answer, and he had long since stopped trying to answer it. He lived to be 93 years old. He spent the last years of his life still speaking when he had the strength to speak, still telling the story, still insisting that the world remember what these weapons had done to two cities on 2 mornings in August of 1945. He was not bitter. He was not broken. He was, improbably, a man who had found a reason to continue, and had held on to that reason across the whole long arc of his life. He died in January of 2010 in Nagasaki, the city where he had been born, the city where he had built his life, the city where a bomb had fallen around him and had not managed, against all reasonable expectation, to kill him. He was surrounded by family. The city outside was quiet and ordinary, going about its business in the way that cities do, indifferent to the weight of history that certain streets and certain names carry forever. The world noted his passing with the respect it deserved. He was called the last double atomic bomb survivor, the man who had been present at both moments when human beings had used the most destructive weapon ever built against other human beings. The newspapers printed his photograph and summarized his remarkable story in the compressed, factual way that newspapers do. And then the news cycle moved on.
But Tsutomu Yamaguchi did not end with the news cycle. He lived on in the testimonies he had given, in the books written about him, in the words of the students who had heard him speak and who carried some piece of what he had told them into their own lives. He lived on in Nagasaki itself, which continues to exist as a testament to both destruction and recovery, both the worst of what human beings do and the persistent best of what they do afterward. His story is, in its most basic form, a story about survival, but it is more than that. It is a story about bearing witness, about the responsibility that comes with surviving something that others did not survive. It is a story about a man who was twice given the opportunity to die and twice declined, not through any extraordinary heroism, but through the ordinary stubborn persistence of a person who still had things to do, people to love, truths to tell. The white light came for him twice. Twice it found him at a distance just sufficient to leave him alive and scarred. Twice he crawled out of the wreckage and went looking for the people he loved. Twice he was given back a world that had just tried to take itself away from him. What he did with those gifts was to spend the rest of his life making sure that no one who was willing to listen would ever be able to say they had not been warned. He was an ordinary man to whom extraordinary things had happened.
He was a husband, an engineer, and a grandfather, and a witness. He was a man who forgot something one morning and turned back to retrieve it, and in doing so accidentally placed himself inside one of the most significant moments in human history. He was, when all is said and done, simply a man who survived, and who decided that surviving was not enough, that the story needed to be told, that the world needed to hear it from someone who had been there and who was still standing. And so he told it, again and again, for as long as he had breath to tell it. He told it quietly, precisely, without drama, but without omission. He told it the way an engineer would, systematically, honestly, committed to the accuracy of the record. He told it because he believed it mattered. He told it because the people who had died in those two cities could not tell it themselves. And he told it because somewhere in his long and improbable life he had decided that this was what he was for, the man who survived both bombs and came home to tell the truth about what they had done.